Today, Jana and my colleague Jana and I are going to talk about kind of navigating some solutions with riparian areas and drought. So we work for a nonprofit society known as Cows and Fish, and our official name is the Riparian Management Society. And we often get asked what cows have to do with fish. And the answer is in the relationships. And in this case, the relationship between livestock and their impact on the landscape and how that impacts fish and in general water. But it isn't just the relationship between cattle and fish. There's many different activities that impact the land and as a result the water. Things like recreational vehicle use, urban and rural development, forestry, off-roading, just to name a few. So part of understanding the approach that Cows and Fish takes is understanding that fish aren't just a product of the water that they reside in, but also a product of the landscape and our actions as well. So Cows and Fish's approach is about understanding that we're all part of the watershed, and our activities, whether that's grazing or recreating, add up to impact our watersheds and our riparian areas. So if you're not familiar with the term riparian area or the boundaries of a riparian area, you can think of them as wetter than dry, but drier than wet. Riparian areas are those transition zones between the open water and the drier uplands. The plants are water loving and the soils are saturated for a longer time throughout the year. If you've worked with us much, you know that we set the bar really high for our love for riparian areas. We know that these dynamic, resilient, and unique and ecologically important pieces of the landscape that we call riparian areas are worthy of being called ecological powerhouses. They're providing us with flood and drought protection, fish and wildlife habitat, and clean water, just to name a few. So on lakes and wetlands where that visible riparian area is can vary greatly throughout the season and also from year to year. Sometimes it's dry, sometimes it might be underwater. And change is one thing that we can count on in riparian areas. They're dynamic with the seasons, with the precipitation, but water on the surface isn't always the best indicator of where that riparian area lies. It's really important to look for the ecological features of that riparian area rather than a set distance. And we encourage others to think about them in the same way. So they vary in width depending on valley type, soils, water regimes, water body type. And so in some places, riparian areas may only be a meter wide, but in other areas, they can be hundreds of meters wide. And that's how we like to think of them in terms of their ecological extent and not just a jurisdictional line. And again, we encourage others to think about them kind of in the same way. And so whether they're groundwater or surface water influenced, these areas tend to be more green, more lush, and more productive than some of their adjacent uplands. And the greenness of them tends to really show itself later in the season and in more southern parts of the province, where you can see clearly where the riparian is, where that extra water is causing the vegetation to still be more lush later into the year. And riparian areas occupy as little as 2% of the landscape, and so that's just a really very small portion. However, again, they tend to be some of those more productive areas on our landscape, and their importance and significance far outweighs what their small size would indicate. So riparian areas are important for many different facets of life. In general, we care about riparian areas because of their benefits to agriculture, industry, tourism, and recreation, and as well as their benefits for biodiversity, water quality, and water quantity. And healthy functioning riparian areas offer resiliency and stability to things like floods and drought, and also provide us with numerous ecological goods and services. So riparian areas are a unique part of the landscape with their proximity to water, which influences the soils and the plants that are present. It's this interaction between water, soil, and vegetation that makes that riparian area unique, as well as sensitive and very important in terms of the role that it plays on our landscape. The functions that happen in riparian areas are related to water quality, water quantity, or supply, primary productivity, and biodiversity, all things that are important to not only fish and wildlife, but humans as well. When the landscape is healthy, these ecosystem services like clean water, water storage, and security fish and wildlife are able to flow freely from that riparian tap. You may see some things on here that you value as well, but consider that without a healthy, resilient landscape, we may not be able to enjoy all of the functions and ecological goods and services that riparian areas can provide. This is a pretty long list of things that we get from such a small portion of the landscape. And so riparian areas are too productive, too valuable, and too important to go unrecognized and unmanaged. An understanding of how these riparian areas are formed and how they function is the first step in understanding how to manage them. Riparian areas have superpowers and we're continually learning more about their impact on the landscape. So for example, there was a study done in Saskatchewan that showed that 10 wetlands, 1 hectare in size, were able to remove more nutrients from the water than one wetland that was 10 hectares in size. Riparian areas do a lot of things for society that we can't visually see. And so it makes it really difficult to kind of place a value on those things that we're getting from the land. For example, modeling showed that for wetlands in the prairie pothole region, there was a cooling effect of 1 to 3 degrees in the summer in summer temperatures where the wetlands were abundant. So in particular, in the simulation that they ran, it showed that it reduced the number of hot days over the summer of 2006 by about 10 days when there was a long-lasting heat wave. And so this research has great implications for the land and surface regional climate modeling as wetland conservation, especially in mitigating some of those extreme heat and drought periods that are expected to happen under climate change. So stream bank vegetation slows stream flow, especially during high water events, and it allows more water to be added to that groundwater storage. A high groundwater table supports a wide and productive riparian area, and healthy riparian areas are able to perform all of these ecological goods and services better than some unhealthy sites where some of those functions may be lost. The plants that we see can give us an indication of how healthy a riparian area is. And those plants that we see on the right here, so we have, some willows in the background, some sedges and rushes along here, maybe some poplars or aspens up at the top, are signs of a healthy and functioning riparian area. And so other species, like disturbance-caused plants or invasive species, are signs that a riparian area may be unhealthy or healthy but with problems, and may not be functioning to the best of its ability. It does take some getting used to recognize and appreciate the difference between an ecologically functioning landscape and one that's not, even if the clues are right across the fence. Part of it is gaining an awareness of these riparian functions by measuring their condition and thus getting a better understanding of how our actions impact them, and thus our ability to enjoy clean and abundant water, forests, grasslands, hiking, and fishing, or not. One of these presents more opportunities for an agricultural operation than the other. So which version of this site is going to store more water? The top photo is missing numerous pieces that I discussed earlier. We have some bare ground here. There's not a diversity of different types of vegetation, whether that's different types of plants, but also structural diversity, compared to the bottom here where we have a mix of different species, different layers, and different types of plants. And so therefore the bottom is likely able to perform those riparian functions much better than the top. But recovery potential is always high, especially when those pieces are still in place. So I think everyone could see the difference between those photo comparisons, but let's put what we see into words. So what exactly is it that makes a riparian area healthy? And so things like successful reproduction and establishment of seedlings, saplings, and mature trees to give that diversity on a site, as well as maintain those deep binding roots that are going to hold the soils together from stream or shoreline erosion. No bare ground, which would be then susceptible to those invasive and disturbance species. And riparian management strategies really strive to reflect those indicators. So streams with healthy riparian areas that are well vegetated with meanders will chug along and maintain their functions and values. But streams respond to straightening and vegetation removal by racing. And this chain reaction can reduce the productive nature of riparian areas by not allowing natural meanders to slow the water down, limiting the ability of the riparian area to catch and store that much needed water. Riparian areas along streams and rivers, around lakes, wetlands, ponds, and sloughs also act like sponges. So this is where that water is absorbed and then cleaned. If we compact that sponge, then we end up with more direct runoff and less filtering ability, which can mean more nutrients in the lake or stream, which can affect then water quality. Also, less water being absorbed means that there's less water quantity. And in short term, we might get a lot of water, but then in the long term, there will likely be less. Harder surfaces also means that the water is moving faster, which creates more energy, and then which can then erode, and then the cycle will continue. So here we show some examples of what we call good mud and bad mud, because not all mud is created equal. Bad mud is the mud that you get from human-caused erosion due to a lack of deep-binding roots, recreation, cattle trails, or runoff from infrastructure. And good mud is that mud that's captured during floods. The new sediments that are deposited in the bank are perfect medium for your young poplars and willows to sprout and all that new native vegetation to grow. And it also removes unwanted nutrients from the water. So all these functions of trapping sediment, slowing down water, dissipating energy, reducing erosion, and nutrient uptake by the plants can also translate into that cleaner water. Healthy riparian areas, again, are valuable to do this much better than unhealthy ones. And cleaner water benefits fish and other aquatic animals and reduces water treatment costs downstream because there's less to filter out once the water gets to that plant or the livestock. So in addition to water quality, riparian areas are also impact water quantity, which is especially important in drought years. So healthy floodplains, which are well vegetated, like this one over here, slow that flow of water and allow the water to spread out more evenly and soak more efficiently into the ground. As mentioned before, the water flows over less healthy riparian areas that are less vegetated, then that water is just going to run right off and not linger there long enough to really soak into the ground. For most streams, the flow in the late summer, fall, and winter is really just a withdrawal of that spring investment. So basically, if you're not absorbing all that water in the spring, then there's not that water left in the reserve to be able to be released later in the season. And so if you don't plan wisely for your water investments, the risk can be high, but the rewards poor. For streams and rivers, they don't act in isolation. The impacts on them are influenced by what's happening in the watershed and elsewhere on the landscape as well. So watersheds with more intact wetlands and riparian areas result in lower peak flows and during high water events. And then ones that have less wetlands or less healthy riparian areas are going to have that kind of more flashiness where the water is getting a lot of water at once because it's not soaking into the ground, and then it's releasing sooner. So here we have that. So when you have more wetlands, you're getting that lower peak, but then you've absorbed all that water, and so the base flow is higher because you have more in that reserve that is being released later into the season. And so the opposite is true when you don't have healthy riparian areas or a lot of wetlands. That water is running right off the landscape, especially in like urban development areas where you have a lot of that concrete. You're not getting that infiltration, and so you're not getting that water storage. So more water in the reserve means that more reliable water supply for livestock watering and irrigation, as well as soil moisture available for crops and pastures. And those streams and rivers will run longer, and lakes and wetlands will be more full or have less dramatic fluctuations. So hand in hand with enough water under your operation for crops and forages and livestock is that we need enough feed. So riparian areas are also producers of primary productivity and forage. So many riparian sites were looked at over a several year period, and they found that when in healthy or near healthy condition, they can produce up to 6,000 pounds per acre of forage. And these were grazed wetlands that were used as stockpile forage in the fall and early winter. And the monitoring also showed that grazing in the winter had little to no effect on the species composition, and there were limited alterations to the soil because the ground was still frozen, so didn't have too many impacts. So primary productivity doesn't just translate into forage for livestock and wildlife, but also into shade, shelter, moderating of stream temperatures, trapping carbon, large woody debris supply, timber, and habitat connectivity as well. But riparian areas are also hotbeds for biodiversity, and variety is the spice of life. It leads to resiliency and a better ability to withstand events like disease or pests, and fire or flood. 80% of Alberta's fish and wildlife actually need to use riparian areas for either all or part of their life cycle. So there's a lot of species that are using such a small portion of the landscape. So this also can create some niche markets like on-farm tourism, bird watching, hunting, and fishing opportunities, if that's something that you're interested in as well. And so having a diversity of vegetation with differing flowering periods also contributes to resiliency and resistance to disease or disaster. Your best bet is to design with increased flowering species diversity, such that you have some redundancy and overlap throughout the year for species that are known to be attractive to bees and other pollinators. So having a diversity of vegetation and different bloom periods really benefits pollinators. So what we have here is a list of different bee species, and these is period from April to September. And so each of these lines shows the foraging period for all the different species of bees. And in the yellow here, we have the flowering period of canola. So what this shows is that bees need basically bees need food outside of when the crop flowering period is. So it's really important to have a diversity of different species so that they have that food source throughout the year, which allows them to maintain stable populations. Even beavers with their busyness have a role to play in creating habitat, by slowing down water, storing water, and promoting poplar and willow regeneration. And they are the ultimate riparian engineers. So they can also be a savior in dry years, as beaver activity increases the amount of open water on the landscape by about 9%. And so this was illustrated really well in a study by Dr. Glynis Hood and Suzanne Bailey. They did a study near Elk Island National Park. And so what they did was beavers were eliminated on the landscape in the early 1900s. And so what they did is they looked at aerial imagery from two different drought periods, one in the 1950s before the reintroduction of beaver, and then one in 2002 after beaver had been reintroduced and kind of reestablished in the area. And so what they found was that even though the drought in 2002 was much more severe than the drought in 1950, they actually found a 9% increase in open water on the landscape that they attributed to the beavers. So they found that the beavers actually had a dramatic influence on the amount of open water at a landscape level and that was more than temperature, precipitation, weather patterns, or other climatic variables that they looked at. And so beaver dams can also sometimes act like fire breaks. And so this imagery is from a study in California. And so there was a beaver dam on this section of the creek, but not on this tributary over here. And there was a big wildfire that went through, and you can see that where there was a beaver dam and the water table was likely higher because the dam is holding back that water. The fire wasn't able to burn all the way up to the creek. There was a bit of that buffer that was left. And so these small buffer areas can also act like important refuges for animals and different wildlife species during wildfires as well. So finding alternative ways to keep the beaver, the benefits that beavers provide while mitigating some of the troubles that they cause can also be another option to consider. And so one of the more popular ways people are doing this is with pond levelers. So the purpose of a pond leveler, which I have a demo at the back I can show you as well, is that you put this pipe through the dam and you have a cage at one end that extends in front of the dam or into the pond. And so whatever level you put the pipe at through the dam is the level that the water is going to be maintained at. And the point is that the beavers don't understand that the water is leaking from way out in front of the dam where the pipe comes in, and they keep building on top of the dam. So the water is continually flowing, but the beavers can't figure out where the leak is coming from. Some other options include cages around trees, if cutting down of trees is the biggest issue that you have. Some considerations with that is you need to make sure they're quite tall, because beavers can climb on top of the snow and then stand up and get on top of the cage if it's not high enough, and they'll still cut down your tree. There's also some different options for culverts. You can get culvert protector kind of cages. Important feature with some of the ones that we have installed is that they have a trapezoid shape. And so the beavers will still try to dam up at the front of the cage, but because of that kind of triangular shape, the water will continue to kind of go around the edges. And so the beavers aren't able to fully plug or even get inside of the culvert because of the cage.
I've seen them where they pack those cages.
Yeah, if there's not enough gaps, so then sometimes we do a combo device where we'd have a pond leveler into the cage so that they still can't do it.
Mud on the outside, trees on the outside.
Yeah, they're very crafty, so it's definitely site dependent. But yeah, it takes some trial and error for sure. But if you want some more information, we have lots of the packet. I have the little models as well. So in the end, the ability of a particular stream or wetland to perform these superpowers is linked to how healthy it is. And so Cows and Fish measures riparian health every year by looking at about 150 to 200 sites in a season. And then once we collect all that data, each of the sites is put into a category of either healthy, healthy with problems, or unhealthy. And the sites that are healthier obviously have a little bit higher capacity for performing those riparian functions, like storing water and mitigating flood or drought. But as I mentioned before, if those pieces are still remaining, there's a lot of improvements that can happen in a very short period of time. And sometimes all you need is just a little bit of rest. And so does it make sense to invest in water quality? It's been shown that cows prefer to drink cleaner water and they'll actually drink more of it. And so more water consumed means more feed consumed, which means more weight gained. And cleaner water also contributes to things like less trips to the vet from things like foot issues. And also all these things should really result in some more money in your pocket. And so with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Jana, who's going to talk more about the management aspects. Green is the pointer, and then put this that way.
Thank you, Christina. So as Christina mentioned, I am also a riparian specialist, but I'm also a beef producer in Red Deer County. I'm going to apologize for my somewhat lack of preparedness today. It was a really busy day calving yesterday. Apparently motherhood is an option on windy, rainy, cold spring days. So if I fall asleep while I'm standing up here, just bawl like a calf and I'll be alert in no time. So where do you start if you're considering managing a riparian area to support health and possibly improve water security on your farm or ranch? You can start with the 4 basic range management principles, which work equally well in riparian areas. A quick and simple way of remembering these principles is not too many, not too long, not too early, and not too frequent. This is a good time to mention that we are cows and fish, not cows or fish. Cattle and fish can be managed for the benefit of both, and some riparian areas can be safely grazed when the following principles are kept in mind. Riparian area management is most successful when planned in advance. Riparian areas can be both grazed and hayed. Be sure to calculate your stocking rates. Provide an alternative water source to keep cattle off of the stream banks and out of the water. Watch for overuse of highly palatable plants such as willows and provide growing season rest. In addition, be mindful of nesting times. Continuous heavy use of riparian areas, including human activities, can result in soil, water, and habitat degradation. The problem is that riparian areas are magnets. Everybody wants to hang out and recreate in riparian areas, livestock, wildlife, and even humans. Riparian areas typically have lush green vegetation that provides shelter, so livestock will loiter, leading to overuse. This short-term convenience ends up resulting in long-term health issues. The land becomes tired, and eventually it stops producing. Balance demand with available resources. What does this mean? It means you need to know how many animals you have and what the carrying capacity is of your land, and then determine the length of time you hope to graze. Keeping in mind that riparian areas should really only be grazed when the ground is frozen and the plants are dormant. So, you want to avoid grazing during sensitive times. On my way up here this morning, I saw 3 riparian pastures all being grazed, one by cattle, one by bison, and one by horses. Cattle producers tend to feel the brunt of poor grazing management. It's really not about the animal you have per se. They can all damage a riparian area. It's about understanding how to manage appropriately those riparian areas. Springtime is typically not the best time to utilize your riparian areas because they're so much more susceptible to degradation. The soils are wet, they're soft, they're easy to compact, and the plants are just starting to grow. As Sean McGrath from Round Rock Ranching said, shut the darn gate. When there is a drought or an impending drought, the best thing that you can do is to manage the land properly. Mike Roberts, the past manager of the Waldron Ranch, also said the best thing you can leave on your land is your shadow. Get out there, walk around, understand it, understand how it changes throughout the seasons, and also understand how it changes from year to year, particularly when we're looking at drought years and or high water years. Your riparian pastures that have wetlands, those wetland boundaries fluctuate based on the weather. Consider stockpiling forage if you can. This requires discipline and advanced planning, but it pays off. Having more than one stockpiled pasture is ideal because it allows you to cycle through your pastures and avoid grazing them every year. Adequate rest is important when grazing during the dormant season. A benefit of having more than one pasture that is stockpiled is, as I've mentioned, you can rotate through these stockpiled pastures. Typically, riparian pastures, even if you stockpile them, they shouldn't be grazed every year. You want to graze them every 3 years. Now, this does depend on your riparian pasture. It also depends on the conditions, but you want to keep that in mind. And if you can, try to have more than one stockpiled pasture. This will really benefit you. Riparian pastures can be a good option for emergency forage or as a rotational grazing system. Stockpiled riparian pastures are a great way to extend your grazing system and season. Riparian pastures should be grazed, but it's all in the timing. Research shows that careful use of riparian areas is beneficial, but it needs to happen at the appropriate time in coordination with best management practices and sustainable grazing. When fencing a riparian pasture, make sure that you allow for movement of the water. Streams and rivers meander and wetlands shrink and grow. So build your fence at an appropriate distance from the water body to allow for this movement. Otherwise, you'll be refencing. As we can see here from this picture, the fence line was constructed too close to the edge of the stream. If this fence line is moved back, it's not going to be susceptible to falling into the bank due to that outer bend moving. In addition, it provides a more ample pasture that can be used much more successfully as a riparian pasture. The better condition the pasture was in October, the faster it will recover. Does anybody know what that means?
It's more that was left there before, then the faster it's moved back to the spring.
Right, that's right. And there's two reasons for that. As Dr. Edward Bork, research scientist and professor at the University of Alberta states, deep roots require the most energy to maintain, so they are the first to go. This is why native plants are more susceptible to overgrazing, because when those roots are not maintained, the plant loses its ability to draw from deep soil moisture reserves. The deep roots store energy to keep the plant active during a drought and are also important for long-term survival, making native plants better adapted to dry conditions than tame plants. A key principle of grazing management is to provide effective rest after grazing. It is important to give plants adequate rest during the growing season to allow them to rebuild roots and to restore their energy supply. Rest allows not only for the tops to grow, but also the roots. As we can see from this photo on the right, both above ground and below ground biomass are very important. In this study, the susceptibility of rough fescue to defoliation was demonstrated, where 20% defoliation achieved by cutting individual plants of rough fescue at 5-inch heights every 4 weeks resulted in a reduction of 48% root growth and 21% top growth. So this study was essentially simulating grazing practices. And the root sod on the far right shows a more intensive grazing system. And we can see that as we graze more intensely for longer durations and we keep down the top growth, we also keep down the roots. And so this plant isn't able to access water in the soil, nor is it able to access deep water in the soil, which is really important during times of drought. Carefully calculating stocking rates and adequately resting pastures not only allow plants to recover and maintain health, but they also have the added benefit of allowing litter to accumulate. Litter serves many purposes, including capturing moisture and adding to the forage reserve. Pastures with reduced litter lose moisture through evaporation and runoff and produce less forage than those with adequate litter. And while you're looking down, be sure to also look up. Do you have adequate shelter in your pastures? If you don't have a designated riparian pasture, make sure that the riparian areas within pasture units are not the only source of shade or shelter for livestock, or they will be overused. And this is because cattle, much like us, will seek shelter during the hot parts of the day and or during a storm. Shelter can be used as a distribution tool, and it doesn't always have to be a tree. Windbreaks can provide shade and shelter as well. Pumping from surface water like a wetland or a stream to a remote site, such as troughs, will improve water quality and reduce water losses that occur when livestock have access to surface water sources. For livestock to maximize feed intake and production, they require access to good, clean water. Research has shown that cattle will drink from a trough 8 times out of 10 when given the choice, even if they have access to surface water. Another benefit is improved livestock distribution, depending on placement, so take that into account when designing your system. As mentioned previously, clean pumped water can improve herd health, weight gain, and back fat because water consumption and forage intake are closely related. When cows drink more water, they spend more time grazing and consequently produce more milk for their calves. Research from two separate studies in 2002 and 2005 found that calves that drank clean water from a trough gained up to 9% more weight, an average of 18 pounds each, compared to calves that drank directly out of a dugout. In addition, yearlings gained 23% more when drinking clean water rather than drinking from a pond or dugout. As my colleague mentioned earlier, beavers and not your ag loans officer may be your best friend in drought years when it comes to watering livestock and selecting the location of your offsite stream watering system. These portable systems are easy to use and offer flexibility in your grazing and watering plan, making them a handy distribution tool. In addition, there are quite a few options for funding to purchase these systems, either through the province or potentially through the county that you reside in. Consider other distribution tools as well. A distribution tool is anything that gives you more control over where and when your animals graze and promotes the 3 R's of range and riparian management: rest, recovery, and rotation. Common distribution tools are salt and mineral blocks, watering systems, and sheltering areas. This is an example of an exclusion fence along Dog Pound Creek. The original fence was placed too close to the creek. It didn't account for the dynamic nature of the creek, and we can see the outside bend moving closer to the fence line. The fence was moved farther back, allowing space for the creek to meander, and now there is increased potential to stockpile forage and use this pasture for late fall and early winter grazing. Remember to always monitor what's happening on the landscape and be ready to change your plans based on changing conditions. In 2005, one of the first of our big flood events, we saw the Medicine River climb 20 feet in less than an hour, which was quite significant. We did have our watering system moved. We thought high enough until it started to float down the river. So be mindful, watch the weather, pay attention, and that will serve you well in terms of avoiding some of those unfortunate events. We did actually rescue our off-site watering system, so all was good. Because we were watching, it just rose far more quickly than we had anticipated it would. So remember, just because it's wet in one year doesn't necessarily mean it will be wet. It will be wet the next year. Riparian health monitoring, whether done formally by organizations such as Cows and Fish or more informally by landowners, is a great way to track progress. Remember, however, that change takes time, so be patient. The type of riparian area and how it was managed, the type of soil, the plant community, and as well as current weather all affect the rate of change, so don't get discouraged. Remember, patience is a virtue, not just in parentage, but also in land management. Ranchers and farmers who were surveyed about the benefits of land management changes through the Red Deer County ALUS program noted improved water retention and a more stable water supply, increased species diversity, improved flexibility in grazing management, increased forage production, and improved herd health after adopting best management practices. These planned changes in management included the adoption of alternative watering systems, riparian pasture fencing, exclusion fencing, and sustainable grazing practices. There are many ways to achieve healthy riparian areas. For livestock producers, creating riparian pastures, using off-stream watering systems, changing the timing of use, and adopting rotational grazing practices can provide the rest needed for riparian recovery. There is an upfront investment for these management changes, but healthy riparian areas are literally money in the bank. For example, improved forage production in a riparian pasture can be stockpiled for late fall and early winter grazing, saving a producer from turning on their tractor. Maintaining a healthy riparian area with good clean water means possibly not having to drill a well in search of water. Not all management changes have a big upfront cost. However, sometimes all a site requires is to have the pressure taken off. This is the difference within a year. After improved grazing management practices and a little bit of rest and recovery. In the end, it's about choice. We are given choices, and what we do with those choices influences the land around us and inevitably the water. Manage the land, and the water will take care of itself. Speaking of finances, there are a variety of funding options for riparian and pasture enhancement projects. You can reach out to Cows and Fish. You can reach out to your local county. You can also reach out to the government. There is Drought, there is ALUS, and several other opportunities for funding for implementing some of these best management practices. If anyone would like to further discuss the benefits of riparian area management and how it can help mitigate drought, Christina and I are available for questions after, and you can also contact us at our email addresses listed here. We'd like to take this time to thank our sponsors. The logos represent our board and our supporters. Ultimately, we are about people and partnerships. So maybe we should have rebranded ourselves as People, Cows, and Fish. By sharing our knowledge gained through experience, we can help producers improve the benefits of their land and make better informed decisions. Are there any questions?